I am James Harris, and I was 52 when the events I'm about to share unfolded. I was married to my beloved wife, and we had 2 grown children who we had raised well. I had a good job that I enjoyed, and life was wonderful until it took a turn for the worse. It all began on a Tuesday evening when I worked late but not late enough for my wife to worry. I headed home after rush hour, picking up Chinese food on the way as we had agreed. I parked in the garage, lowered the door, and gathered my briefcase and groceries. I was like a hunter returning home to feed his family, or at least that's how it felt in modern-day America. However, I immediately noticed that my wife's car was not in its usual spot. I assumed she must have left for a last-minute errand and would be back soon. I left the food on the kitchen table to keep it warm, and if she stayed out late, we could heat it up in the microwave. I walked down the hallway to the front door, turned towards the stairs, and headed to our bedroom to change into something more comfortable. It was my usual routine. 10 minutes later, I called out to my wife, but there was no response. I started to wonder where she could have gone and thought she might have left a note. I wasn't alarmed, but I was curious. I walked into the living room and found a note on the coffee table. It wasn't the note I was expecting, but one I never could have imagined. It read, "Dear Jim, I'm sorry to do this to you, but there's someone who needs me. I got a call today, one of those calls that you have to respond to when it comes. I'm sorry for running away without warning, and I know this will be hard for you. But please know that I love you more than life, and I will be back as soon as I can. I cherish the life we created together, and I hope to return to it when I can. Don't worry about me, I will be fine. Your loving wife, Marie." Next to the letter was her cell phone. I was stunned and confused, going over in my mind what I had read in her cryptic letter. Who needed her? Who could be so important that she couldn't tell me who it was? Panic set in, and I started to wonder where she had gone and how urgent it was that she couldn't tell me where she would be. How could she have left her phone behind? When would she get in touch with me? This was not the kind of note a wife leaves her husband when planning to return late at night. Panic turned to fear, and fear turned to anger. How could she do this to me? She just left without explaining why or where she would be. Darker thoughts started to creep into my mind, and I began to question why she left her cell phone behind. I read her note again, but it told me no more than the first time. Who needed her? Who was so important that she had to respond to their call immediately? Who did she think she was? She wasn't a secret agent, a super spy, or a neurosurgeon for the leaders of the free world. Where was my wife? I was angry, but my anger masked my fear. I was worried about my wife, and I wanted to go to her, but I didn't know where she was. I wanted to hear her voice and know she was okay, but I had no way to contact her. I just sat there, rereading her note while dinner got cold, and the sun went down. When it got dark, I finally decided to start calling people. I called her sister, our friends, and finally our kids, but no one knew anything or would tell me anything. Worst of all, I only succeeded in scaring our children. I tried to reassure them that nothing was wrong, but I wasn't very good at it. I disconnected, promising to keep them informed. Now I was even more angry and blamed her for scaring our children, even though I had been involved in the mistake. I read the note again. I cherish the life we created together, and I hope to return to it when I can. These are not the words of someone who will be home in a few hours or even days. I was really scared, and even though I told myself I was overreacting, I called the hospital. She wasn't there. Then I called the police, but they said I couldn't file a missing persons report until 48 hours had passed unless I was reporting a missing child. I thought about lying, but how could I tell them I wanted to report a child who was 5 feet 3 inches with brown hair and could pass for 38 even though she was 49? I thanked them and hung up. I tried to eat something, but I wasn't hungry, so I just put the food I'd bought into the fridge and sat in the darkened living room, hoping she'd come back. She didn't come back. I went upstairs a little after 2 o'clock in the morning and fell asleep. When I awoke the next morning, I stretched and found her side of the bed cold and empty. Everything came over me again, and I lay there wondering what I should do. I called work and told them I would be out. My not showing up for work was such an unusual occurrence that it seemed to cause concern. Before I knew it, my phone was ringing with coworkers wanting to know if I was okay and what they should do about those files. Trying to help them out a little was a cleansing experience for me and took my mind off my worries for at least a little while. I called her office, but they told me that she called in and took the day off. I didn't think they were hiding anything from me, but as time went on, I became more and more convinced that they were as much in the dark as I was. I visited her office a few times, hoping that a face-to-face conversation would be frank, but they didn't know anything more than what I already knew, which meant practically nothing. She left sometime on Tuesday, but I didn't discover she was missing until late Tuesday night, and the police needed 48 hours. So, I went to the police station on Friday morning to file a missing persons report. I showed them her note, and they asked if she had done anything like this before. Yelling at police officers is not a good idea, but by that point, I was not in the best of spirits. They threatened to charge me if I didn't calm down, so I made myself sit down until they decided I was a flashy suspect. Afterward, they said usually, in these cases, the wife runs off with her boyfriend, and I'd probably find out if I get served with divorce papers in the next few days. I've never wanted to punch a police officer so badly, but instead, I just muttered, "Thanks for that," and walked away. I got home and collapsed in my chair, torn apart by stress with nothing to do. I resumed calling friends and family, but this time I had the good sense not to call the kids. Instead, they called me themselves, and I had to tell them that I still didn't know anything, but I'm sure their mom is fine. In other words, I was lying to my kids. A father should never lie to his children, but I had nothing to tell them good or bad except that their mother was still missing. My calls to friends and family on Tuesday night triggered an avalanche of calls to me on Wednesday. Those started out quietly with comments like, "Just to find out," and by Thursday, they were getting more and more concerned. Everyone wanted to know what I was doing to find Marie, and by Friday, the tone of some of them had taken on an unmistakable aggression. No one was talking about it yet, but concern was giving way to accusation. If Friday's calls were bad, Saturday's visits were simply impossible. I was flooded with visitors, friends and family stopping by to see how I was doing. They always started off with words of encouragement, but questions soon followed. "Weren't there any problems between you two? Weren't you two fighting? Was she unhappy?" It got to the point when her mother asked me, "Are you sure you don't know where she is?" I snapped and yelled at my mother-in-law for the first time since we'd known each other. "What the hell are you talking about, Margaret? Are you accusing me of something? Do you really think I'd lie about something like that?" She hesitated and then said, with an angry look that I will remember till the day I die, "It's just that she's never done anything like this before." I shoved my anger and hurt deep down where I hoped they wouldn't show, and in the calmest voice I was capable of, I said, "You think I don't know that?" By then, she was visibly shaking, and her husband said, "Jim, we know you're doing the best you can. Could you tell us what you know, and maybe we can work something out?" I nodded, and we sat in silence. Then I told them everything I knew, or rather, that I knew nothing. I showed them the note, and they were puzzled and concerned in equal measure. The veiled accusations fell away, and we spent a full hour in floods of tears, trying to think of something, anything at all that might explain Marie's sudden disappearance, but we had nothing. Henry and Margaret stayed until lunchtime while I prepared a light lunch for the three of us, or at least I thought it was for the three of us. Our friends seemed to have other things on their minds, and there was a steady stream of people at the front door, some carrying food, others beer, and all wanting to know what had happened and what I knew. At some point, I stopped telling the story. That's when Margaret and Henry intervened, and to their credit, the blame was taken off me, and she gave me high marks for being a concerned husband. I know that everyone had their suspicions in the back of their minds, but at least the feeling remained that I had support. Again, I was simply overwhelmed as one well-wisher after another sat down with me to express their support and concern. I encouraged everyone to contact the police if they thought of anything that might help, but I secretly thought that someone knew something they weren't telling me and hoped the information would reach the authorities, even if I never found out. As far as I could tell, no one knew anything, and other than a few supporters calling the police to ask if they had any leads, nothing happened for weeks. That is, nothing happened for exactly 2 weeks. The police had my wife's car license, along with the model, and they put it on their watch list for possible car thefts. When I made a remark to anyone like, "I hope they find her car so they can possibly find her," they looked at each other like I didn't understand something, and I did. I knew what they were thinking. She had run away, and there was a good chance she wouldn't want to come home, even if she was found. I tried to go out to work, but I was useless there, and everyone told me to go home, so I went home, and there I was, just as useless. First, I sat there and made phone calls, then, I drove around looking for her car. I even drove past her friends' houses, thinking maybe they were hiding her, though I couldn't imagine why. Day after day, I worried, called, drove, and alarmed the police, but got nowhere. In a fit of desperation, I went to my lawyer to ask what I should do, and he put me in touch with a private investigator. Officially, the police said it was my right. Unofficially, I could see that they didn't like it. I was told that private investigators usually interfere with official investigations, so I asked them what they had at the moment. They had nothing, so I told them in language that could politely be called frank that I didn't think a private investigator would interfere with them finding nothing. They didn't like it, but they couldn't object to it either. The private investigator was expensive and came back with exactly the same thing the police already had, nothing. As I said, it was 2 weeks after Marie's disappearance. I was still doing the same things, making phone calls, driving around, and watching the news. But I also started checking Marie's social media, her credit card activity, and our bank accounts. There was nothing on the card, but 2 weeks later, there were withdrawals from an ATM in a town 200 miles away. I immediately called the police and let them know about it. This got their attention, and within half an hour, 2 detectives were at my door, and the suspicions began again. Finally, I looked them in the eye and, in the calmest voice I was capable of, but which in retrospect was only one small step away from rage, I said, "No, I didn't go there, and I didn't use that car. I was here in the city the whole time, calling friends, driving around looking for her car, and doing a hell of a lot more than any of you. Now you have a lead, so get off your fat asses and follow it." They clearly didn't like me very much and just as clearly didn't care, but after half an hour of assurances and veiled accusations, they left. To their credit, they did contact the police in that town and gave them the information about the manhunt for Marie and her car. 2 days later, her car was found in a hospital parking lot. The local police called me and said, "Don't do anything, let us do everything." I replied, "Hell no," and drove off. A little over 3 hours later, I pulled into the parking lot. It took about 2 minutes to find her car, but it felt like 2 hours to me. I also noticed 2 people in suits in a car, cops. I parked and walked over to them. I guess they were waiting for me. I showed them my driver's license and said, "Show me your badges." They looked at each other and, being disgruntled, still did as I asked. I knelt down and asked them to tell me what they knew, but all they knew was that they had the car, and no one had approached it since they got there. When I said I was going to go ask about my wife, they informed me that they had already asked. I thanked them with all the fake sincerity I was capable of and informed them that I was going to do it anyway. My tension was building quickly, and making friends here was not something I was going to do. The hospital receptionist didn't know my wife's name and didn't know anything about the car parked outside, so I decided to join the stakeout. I had nothing to hide and everything to gain, so I asked to sit in the back seat of their car. It was probably the first time I had surprised a police officer since it all started, but they agreed, and I joined them for the next hour. We talked, and I briefly told them the little I knew. When their shift was over, and it was time for them to leave. They agreed to let me keep an eye on the car but made one thing clear: if anyone comes for the car, whether they're coming out of the hospital or driving up to it, don't interfere. Just call us and tell us the car is moving. Don't try to follow it. Don't do anything but call us. Do you understand? I nodded. Remember, there's a small chance they have your wife and will lead us to her, but there's a bigger chance that it's just that they bought the car from someone else and don't know anything. However, they may be able to help us track down the person who sold them the car. It's very important that you do nothing. Do you understand? For the first time since this whole thing started, I actually understood and agreed. I went back to my car, and for the next 3 hours, I sat there hunched over in the seat, watching Marie's car. The only time I left my post was for the fastest urination in history. When I walked in and out of the hospital so fast, I was still buttoning my fly as I crossed the lobby. An hour later, I saw a woman walking toward the car, and my heart stopped. I tried to catch my breath. It was Marie. She opened the car door and pulled out something small, then closed it and headed back to the hospital. I followed her, keeping my distance. Something told me that if she knew I was here, I'd never get to the truth. When we entered the hospital, I was about 20 feet behind her. I watched as she entered the elevator, and as the elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, it wasn't long before I looked into the room and saw her sitting by the man's bed. The man appeared to be asleep or unconscious, and she was holding his hand. I coughed, and when she turned around and saw me standing in the doorway, my beloved and loving wife fainted. I was angry and confused but called for a nurse who attended to her until she regained consciousness. Most of this time, I spent studying the man in the bed. I had never seen him before. He was neither friend nor relative, just a man. But it was clear that to Marie, he was more important than her marriage, more important than her family, and seemingly more important than me. One mystery solved, and immediately a new one appears. While the nurse helped Marie up off the floor, I took the opportunity to call the local detectives and let them know that my wife had been found. They told us to stay put, and they would be right over. I gave them the room number. Life was starting to get very interesting, and as I looked at the man in the bed, I felt a cold chill in my heart where fear used to be. Coming to her senses, Marie was almost hysterical and only shook her head when I calmly and coldly asked her questions. Why, Marie? Who was that man? Why did you run away like that? Why didn't you tell us where you were? Why didn't you tell us you were all right, Marie? What's going on, for God's sake? A few times, she looked like she was going to answer, but then she lowered her head and started sobbing again. I stood there waiting, asking, and wondering when the detectives arrived. I let them have the upper hand and stepped aside, but they immediately asked me to step outside. One of them joined me and asked a dozen questions. I simply told him the truth, that I'd seen Marie approach the car, followed her, and then confronted her in the ward. Confronted, perhaps not a good choice of word, and for the next 5 minutes, I assured him that I had done her no harm. When he learned that the nurse had found her lying on the floor, the questions resumed with greater seriousness. All this time, his partner had been talking to Marie. In time, I think I convinced them that I hadn't hurt my wife, or maybe she convinced them. I don't know. They wanted me to leave, so I called the ward and said, Marie, if I leave here, I'll divorce you. Do you understand me? That made her hysterical again, and she begged me not to leave. Then I looked the detective in the eye and said, I'm not going anywhere until I get some answers. Eventually, I was allowed back into the room. As quietly and calmly as I could, I began to ask Marie the questions that were burning in my brain. Marie gave only cryptic half-answers. He is her high school boyfriend, was her first love, is dying, and has no one. There were long pauses of information left between those lines, but I was left to ask or guess. How did you live here for 2 weeks without using your charge card? She was silent for a long time before she finally gave it away. I lived at his house. So, you know where he lives, of course. And you have a key? She nodded silently. How long have you had a key to his house? She shrugged silently and looked at the floor. I knew that as soon as I made the accusation, there would be hell to pay if I turned out to be wrong. Still, 2 weeks is more than a man should have to wait in the dark for answers. How long ago, Marie? She didn't answer. How long has the affair been going on? She didn't answer the question or refute the accusation. At times like this, the mind goes quiet. Later, there will be time for new questions and new pain. Okay, I think at the very least, you should show me his house. I want you to take me to where you're staying. She stared at me in horror as panic overcame her. Finally, she gave up and nodded silently. She grabbed her coat, and we headed to my car. I'll drive you, I said, and then I'll bring you back. She seemed surprised but agreed. I guess by then, the detectives had decided it was a private matter. With a final warning not to do anything stupid, they left. Marie was silent most of the way, only giving me directions as needed. At one point, she barely audibly whispered, I was told that we might be required to reimburse the police for the time wasted. I wanted to ask, who is this "we" you speak of, but I didn't. God only knows what my pulse and blood pressure were like. I could barely stand on my feet as we pulled into the short driveway in front of the townhouse. I realized that inside, I would likely find the answers to my questions. Marie led us into the house, and as we walked through the living room, I immediately noticed my wife's pair of shoes on the floor by the couch. Her favorite scarf lay on the chair. I wandered down the hallway when Marie called out, James, please don't go in there. If ever my wife's words had the opposite effect, this was that moment. I entered the master bedroom. Marie's clothes were scattered on the untidy bed and chair, and her makeup and other things were on the dresser. It was only when I opened the closet and saw the familiar dresses there that my last doubts left me. There was a blue dress that was her favorite, but I knew for a fact that it was hanging in her closet at home. It's a duplicate, and there were several pairs of shoes seemingly in her size and the style she liked. These were things she hadn't packed for the trip. These are things she kept here. There was no doubt in me now, and I realized that if I opened a few drawers, I would find her underwear and such. The room seemed set up not so much for living as for the occasional sleepover visit, dinner, and dancing, and then intimacy and sleep in the arms of a lover. I returned to the living room, feeling defeated, where I found Marie sitting quietly on the edge of a chair, staring aimlessly at the floor. So, is there something you want to tell me? She only shook her head slowly. How long has it been, Marie? Clearly, this is not a platonic relationship. How long has it been? She shrugged silently as if she didn't know the answer, but obviously, she did and didn't want to say. Who is he to you? She was silent for a long time, then answered in a quiet voice, I had him first. We were together when we were in high school. I wondered if she meant high school or college, but both were long enough ago that I decided it didn't matter. How long have you been seeing him behind my back? That made her head jerk sharply, but she couldn't deny it. She would have wanted to deny it, wanted it to be untrue, but we both knew it wasn't. We got back together about 7 years ago. At first, it was just lunches, then dinners. One night when you were out of town, we went to a dance. It was a year before we. She stammered. Before you had sex. She nodded her head slowly. So, you had sex with him behind my back for 6 years? How did you do it? Did you come over here, or does he come to our house? This elicited an immediate reaction from Marie. Her head jerked upward. I never brought him to our house. I swear. I wouldn't do that to you. I nodded, feeling angry. So, you can sleep with him, but you won't entertain him in our house. Glad to hear you draw the line somewhere. She got angry but couldn't deny anything. After a long silence, she said, I never stopped loving you. He never took anything from you. I swear it was only a few nights a year, and I stayed with you forever. It was a lie taken from a cheater's playbook, and I thought, what's the point of arguing? But there was a point. It took away at least part of the love you said you had for me. You were saving a part of your heart for him. You lied to me repeatedly because of him, made vows to me, but gave him a part of yourself that you said was only for me. Don't tell me he never took anything from me. He took everything, even if you don't think so, Marie. She was crying, and I stood silently by her side. I knew everything I needed to know. I thought about trashing his house, smashing everything I could, but he wouldn't come back here. In the end, I just gave up. Come on, Marie. I'll take you back to your lover's bedside. This brought on a new round of tears, but my heart was broken, and I had nothing to comfort her with. I drove her back to the hospital, and getting out of the car, she begged me, James, please give me some time. He has no one. I can't let him die alone. I'll be home soon. The last sentence elicited a short sob. I'll be home soon, and we can go back to our life together. Please, I love you. I swear. I nodded silently and let her go, telling her he was waiting for her. I think by then, she had already realized that it was over between us. I drove home slowly for 4 hours, and I don't remember any of it. I was devastated. 2 weeks of stress and worry, all these friends and family telling me not to give up hope, and now I found out that she had been with her lover the whole time. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. I only managed to stumble into the house and sink into my favorite chair. I don't know how much time passed before the first phone call rang. It was her parents, and they wanted to know where I had been and if I had learned anything. That's when I realized I had driven 200 miles without saying a word to anyone. I briefly considered sparing Marie the embarrassment, but apparently, I had spent the last vestiges of my manly love for the woman who had betrayed me over the years. So, I told Henry and Margaret everything. They didn't want to believe it until I described what I had found in his house. At that point, it didn't matter if they believed me or not. My marriage was over. I knew it without having to think about it. It was a fact that burst from the depths of my soul, crushed my heart, and consumed me. It's over between Marie and me. She loves another man, and I'm not the sharing type. Worse, she spent years lying to me, acting secretly behind my back, and giving herself to him. This is not a mistake. This is a life of betrayal, and we can't go back to that. I called her friends to tell them the news, and I spared nothing. I restrained my anger as best I could, but I didn't lie for her. After using them for practice, I called our children and tried to gently but honestly tell them that I had found their mother and that she was with her lover, dying in a hospital bed. They didn't want to believe it, so I told them about the townhouse. When they asked if I could forgive her, I said, maybe someday, but I will never trust her again. I apologized to both of them but told them I was divorcing their mother. Then, forgetting that they still had no way of contacting her, I asked them not to tell her about it. I said she needed all the time she had left to spend with him, and her rushing home wouldn't change anything. They argued with me, but eventually, they understood. 2 weeks later, he died, and Marie came home, but I was no longer there. A week after she returned, she was served with divorce papers. I didn't leave town, quit my job, or hide from her. I just moved apartments until I eventually found a place that suited me. I was close enough to the old house that the kids could visit us both. Marie tried to change my mind. I let her. She would come to my office or apartment and beg me to change my mind, but I had already made up my mind. She cried and threatened, but it didn't change anything. It lasted 6 years. 6 years of betrayal, and if you count lunches, dinners, and dances, 7. In the end, it was the lies at least as much as the sex that ruined our marriage. When I found out how well and how easily she lied to me, lied right to my face with a smile, I realized she didn't look at me with the same devotion I looked at her with. It's been 2 years since the divorce became final. I don't ask, but the kids say their mother just goes to work and then home. She doesn't go anywhere, or so they think. It saddens me that she is suffering so much, but I can't help her. To this day, I can't tell if she is grieving the loss of her first love or the marriage she betrayed. I'm not doing so well myself. I'm not healed, but the pain is slowly lessening. I don't date either, but I've started noticing other women and suspect I'll eventually dip into the dating pool. I am far from trusting another woman outside of a professional environment. I'll never know why she betrayed me, what she lacked, what I couldn't give her, or how she justified her behavior. I suppose I could ask, but what would be the point? It was her decision, and she had somehow, at that point, come to terms with it. I never told anyone about it because I doubt they would believe me even now. But I never learned his name. There was a man lying on his deathbed in a townhouse where my wife played family when they were together. That's enough for me. You can't get revenge on the dead, and I realized I couldn't forgive the wife who betrayed me,